All right. Good afternoon to everyone who is here in person. Good afternoon to everyone joining us via Zoom. And feel free to continue nibbling on your lunch. We just want to ask that we bring our volume to a minimum as we prepare for our next speaker, who is Mary Grant from the Food and Water Watch, to discuss regionalization, consolidation, and privatization. Get those voices just a little bit lower so everybody can hear. Once again, we are welcoming everyone back, and please continue to nibble on your food. Welcome back to everyone that is joining us via Zoom. Our next speaker is Mary Grant from Food and Water Watch. She's going to discuss regionalization, consolidation, and privatization. Mary Grant is the director of the Public Water for All campaign at Food and Water Watch, a national environment group that mobilizes regular people to build political power, to move bold and uncompromised solutions to the most pressing food, water, and climate problems of our time. Since 2015, Mary has overseen campaigns at the local, state, and federal level to support universal access to water and sanitation and promote responsible and affordable public provision of water and sewer service in the United States. Mary is a policy analyst on U.S. water utility privatization. At this time, please join me in welcoming Ms. Mary Grant.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Freshwater Future for holding this convening today and for allowing me to join you remotely. I'm in Baltimore right now. I'm Mary Grant, again, the Public Water for All campaign director at Food and Water Watch, and I work on our campaigns to support safe, affordable, and publicly controlled water across the country. Today, I'm going to talk about the fight for local control, regionalization, consolidation, and privatization. I'll begin with some background, and then I'll talk about public sector partnerships, privatization, then go into some emerging issues and proposed solutions. We'll have time at the end for questions, comments, and hopefully a discussion. So I'm going to start with some background. First, I want to make sure we have a common understanding about these terms. Various entities and interests use different terms to describe a range of changes to who controls a water or wastewater system. Private companies, for example, like to refer to all types of privatization as consolidation or regionalization. Perhaps that is to mask what is really going on and really at stake. So regionalization generally refers to the process of transferring control from local entities to a regional entity. Sometimes an already regional system is forced into regionalization process, not to expand the service area per se, but to change who makes the big decisions about that already regional system. Consolidation is merging utilities together. Often that involves joint ownership. The systems could be physically interconnected to become one big water system, or they could be operated separately through a joint manager or a satellite operation. At the heart of this debate is control. For many people, water is a very local issue, and people value local control and want solutions for water quality concerns that support and improve their local decision-making powers, not strip them away. I want to set the stage by sharing some information that underlies a lot of this debate about regionalization, consolidation, privatization. Here are basic stats about the number of systems and % of people served by those systems. Many of you probably have heard similar figures thrown around. So across the country, about 10 to 20% of people who live in more rural areas have household wells and septic systems. Almost everyone else is connected to a centralized drinking water and wastewater treatment system and are in areas where local governments must manage stormwater through MS4 stormwater permits. So there are tens of thousands of systems across the country, 50,000 water systems, some 16,000 sewer systems. But to put that in perspective, there are also more than 90,000 local governments. Often you'll hear folks comparing the fragmentation of water systems with other utilities, like power and gas, which are almost all privately owned. Instead of comparing them with the breakdown of our local governments or thinking about who actually owns those systems, a utility can be very different than a system. A utility can own multiple systems. Often county utilities own multiple water systems. So the terms that we use are also important. More than half of water systems are very small. They serve fewer than 500 people. But these tiny, tiny systems serve only about 1% of the US population. Most people get their water from a larger system, typically their local government. These very small systems do really have the worst water quality compliance. They often don't even file water quality reports at all. Don't comply with monitoring and testing requirements that can mask those health-based violations. Per capita costs are higher in smaller systems. They can really struggle. And study after study has found that water quality violations are most common in small systems, but even more specifically, small systems serving rural communities of color. And so it's in that context that is driving many environmental groups as well as agencies, including EPA, to advocate for system consolidation and regionalization. Many states offer sweeteners and incentives to encourage this process or partnerships. There are both sticks and carrots driving this. The sticks are compliance measures, including fines, consent decrees. The carrots are funding and compliance waivers. There is a lot of money going to support consolidation efforts. From 2009 to 2016, there were 265 drinking water state revolving fund assistance agreements for system consolidation or regionalization involving 2 or more water systems. 80% of these agreements included systems serving 10,000 or fewer people. That means there's 20% that involve even larger systems. Funding can also be used to support planning and analysis needed for transactions that don't involve ownership change, so like contracting out and shared management services. So you'll hear more about federal funding from David Wheaton at LVF in the next presentation, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I want to make it clear that there is a lot of money and effort from the federal government down, driving these discussions, both from public and private actors. And what does it mean? What does it look like? So EPA uses the term partnership to describe some of the forms that these deals can take. And they too recognize that the scale is a continuum of how much control is transferred away. They use the term responsibility for control. Regionalization can involve informal cooperation to outsourcing or shared services to a full sale of a system. Both EPA and many big environmental groups are generally neutral on whether or not consolidation or regionalization involves privatization. That is to say that they don't really care if it's public or private. For example, the EPA appointee in Jackson, Mississippi, privatized the operations to a firm called Jacobs. And workers there were pushed out of their union. They lost their pensions if they chose to stay with the water system. We've seen that private companies are very adept at taking advantage of federal sweeteners to grow their businesses. So this is just a note of caution that these various forces advocating consolidation are out there, and they're doing it without an analysis of privatization. So first, before I discuss the risks of water privatization, I want to address public sector forms of collaboration and consolidation. When partnerships are public-to-public collaboration that typically don't involve transferring ownership, we call these public-public partnerships, or PUPs. There's a global movement to promote public-public partnerships as an alternative to privatization to improve local water services. These arrangements can fall into kind of 3 broad categories, again, on a continuum of how much control is transferred. So the simplest way of doing this is like bulk purchasing. So through bulk purchasing consortiums and agreements, utilities and other public sector entities can save money and time by coming together to buy their chemicals, equipment, fuel, and other supplies in bulk. There's also shared services. So water utilities can save money when they work together through joint capital projects or shared service agreements. So for example, rather than building 2 separate water tanks, 2 nearby utilities can come together to build a new single larger water tank to lower total investment costs. There's also re-engineering. So public utilities can partner with well-run public utilities or team them up with non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, or their own worker labor unions to creatively make improvements. These partnerships allow combined expertise of technicians, engineers, and frontline employees to help maximize services and reduce costs. And many studies have found that public sector collaboration is more effective, more efficient, and more equitable than privatization. Another public sector solution in this space is something we call Food and Water Watch municipalization. It's kind of a wonky term, but it is the purchase of a privately owned system by a local government. This actually happens more often than privatization of systems. So remember how about half of systems are very small? Well, the bulk of these very small systems that tend to have the worst compliance records are privately owned. These can be ancillary systems like manufactured home parks that provide water in addition to their main business, like leasing land. It can also be very small systems that are already owned by a larger investor-owned utility. That's because a change in ownership does not necessarily mean a physical connection and joining of systems. These small private systems are frequently bought by local governments, and that improves water service and it lowers costs. One good example of this is the Florida Governmental Utility Authority, which was created specifically to buy these terrible private water companies and improve them before transferring them over to the local governments. So it's a consolidation, an improvement, and then a return to local control. This is an interesting model, and it has been used on more than 100 small systems in the state, including some that had been previously owned by some of the biggest investor-owned water utilities. This authority bought almost all of the water systems of Aqua Utilities Florida, a company that now goes by Central Utilities. Aqua exited the state of Florida entirely after considerable public opposition to their poor service and high rates, and they sold the bulk of their systems to this governmental utility authority. Public sector regionalization and consolidation of publicly owned systems is not always so clearly positive. It can be really nuanced, and it must be contextualized in the histories of the communities where it is proposed. Regionalization has been a tool by majority white states and majority white counties to strip away control of major assets from majority Black communities and their elected officials. Much like in Detroit, when the system was already regional, the issue was control. Often wealthier, whiter counties want control of assets owned by majority Black cities. One ongoing example of this is where I am in Baltimore. Right now, tonight, there is a meeting of a task force created by the state to recommend a new governance model for Baltimore's water system. This task force has 4 months, just 4 months, to make a recommendation that could be enacted as early as next year. There is no racial or economic equity study, no legal analysis, very little opportunity for public engagement. The meetings aren't located outside the city core. There's only 4 in person. And overall, it's a rush to decide the future of the water system. While the system does not lack for challenges, there has been a lot of progress made to address unaffordable water bills through a percentage of income water affordability program. The city's also banned water shutoffs for vulnerable households. Baltimore's banned water privatization, and it's set up a customer advocates office to address customer disputes. Will all of that work and progress just be thrown out with the bathwater through this process? It's an open concern, and we're going to see what happens. It's an ongoing fight there. So that's why I think it's important that efforts that would take away local control from locally elected officials have to proceed with extreme caution and strong public participation and engagement. Here are just 5 suggestions or points to be included in this process. This is not intended to be a comprehensive list, but it's just some aspects that seem to be left out often of regionalization and consolidation efforts. I think that you need to protect local decision-making. You need to protect the ability of local elected officials to influence public policy about water. You need to remove all forms of water privatization from consideration. There needs to be a racial and economic equity impact assessment. And you have to use a transparent and accountable public process and structures from the very beginning of studying, of going through a regional and consolidation effort. It has to be open, transparent, and accountable. And then also, you need to have an alternatives analysis. And I don't know if it's called this, but I'm going to use the term root cause analysis. You have to ask, are you really addressing what's wrong? On that last point in Baltimore, a key issue is staffing and the lack of pay equity in the region. How will a new governance structure address that concern? We've actually heard from labor unions just this morning that the process is actually creating more harm by causing job insecurity that is driving workers to leave. So it's creating more staffing shortfalls right now. So wouldn't it be better just to tackle the staffing shortfall and the pay equity issue head on? I fear also that in Baltimore, the process is not just a red herring that's distracting from the central issues that are driving water quality concerns, but it could actually undermine efforts to address those problems by diverting resources away from achieving compliance toward and away from completion timelines for essential capital improvements. We cannot expect consolidation or regionalization to be a silver bullet. You can't even expect it to always lead to better outcomes. Privatization can tell this tale of caution best. So let me back up. Sometimes when I talk about water privatization, people are shocked. They are unaware that private water utilities even exist. It's understandable. It's kind of an absurd concept, right? That your water could be, your water system, your water could be owned by this for-profit entity. And also most people in the United States actually receive their water service from a publicly owned system, usually their local government. Nearly 90% of people who are on a centralized water system get that water service from a publicly owned system. And more than 95% of people get wastewater treatment service from a publicly owned treatment system. There are regional differences in private control of water systems. There's very little private ownership in the South, in the Plains, in Michigan too, very little private ownership. In comparison, some states have a lot of privatization, like New Jersey. There are a lot of reasons why private water prevails nationally. It's about control of decision-making and investments to lower costs and better regional coordination, in fact. But historically, many of our nation's water systems from New York to San Francisco were privately owned and controlled, but it was a disaster. So for a big example, in New York City, the predecessor of the bank, JP Morgan Chase, used to control the water supply. The city took it over in the 1800s after a cholera epidemic killed 3,500 people. Huge fires roiled the city and caused massive property destruction. The company was blamed because this bank refused to extend water service to low-income areas of the city where it didn't think it could make money. In the 1800s, thousands of cities across the country took control of their water systems from private entities to improve water quality, lower costs, and provide more equitable service. Overall, public water has led to better access and improved water quality, helping to prevent the spread of diseases. Local governments extended water lines to low-income and Black communities in particular that had been historically excluded by those private companies. There's a really interesting analysis that found that public ownership of water systems cut typhoid rates in Black communities in the South by as much as 42%. So, like other public sector arrangements, privatization can take a number of forms. And again, this is on a scale of how much control is transferred away from local governments to that for-profit entity. Systems can be fully owned and operated by local governments. There's various forms of what are known as public-private partnership contracts, and it can go all the way to a full outright sale to an investor-owned utility. Public-private partnerships fall in the middle and involve public ownership, so the city or the local government retains ownership, but they privatize operations, management, and sometimes financing under concession deals. But most privatization contracts are short-term, 2 to 5 year operation and maintenance contracts. It's actually really rare to have a public-private partnership deal that involves private financing. It's because private financing is very expensive. So again, the heart of the issue is about who controls the system. Who makes the big decisions about where to extend lines, what investments to prioritize and where, who gets their lead pipes replaced first, how do we charge for service, what are our shutoff policies, what are our tax sale policies, what type of affordability programs do we set up? It's about accountability and transparency in those decisions. With public control, you should have access to meetings where those decisions are being made. You should be able to directly communicate with the decision makers. You can email the mayor or the city council. But with private control, the public is cut out. It's a black box of a corporate boardroom, which is exempt from state transparency laws. You can't FOIA a water corporation CEO. Water prices are approved by not the city council or a public body, but usually by appointed officials at the Public Service Commission. And the process is very difficult for regular folks to engage in. In Michigan, the PSC doesn't even approve rates of private companies. And in terms of water prices, our study found, like almost every other study I've seen, is that private water is so much more expensive than local government service. We compiled the data for the 500 largest community water systems and found that on average, among these systems, private water charges 59% more than local governments charge for the same amount of water. Researchers from Cornell University found that privately owned water systems charge statistically higher rates, but they also found that private ownership was the single biggest factor driving higher rates, even more than drought or aging infrastructure. And the key reason at the end of the day is corporate profit. These corporations exist to make money for their owners. They earn a rate of return on their investment of about 10% plus profits or plus taxes. So state regulators allow them to add about 10% onto the cost of every single improvement project, every new acquisition. And they pass all of that on, plus taxes, income taxes, property taxes, onto customers through higher rates. I want to flag that privatization doesn't mean that there will be fewer water systems. It doesn't necessarily mean a physical interconnection or reducing the so-called fragmentation of the water sector. Here's information from the ESG report of the nation's second largest investor-owned water utility, Essential, or formerly Aqua America. 92% of the systems this company owns are very small, 92% of their systems. That compares to the national average of about a little bit more than 50% of systems are very small. Also in that report, there are some notable metrics. Despite being one of the largest investor-owned utilities, 59% of their water systems had water quality violations last year. There were thousands of unplanned service disruptions, millions of gallons of sewage spills, and tens of thousands of water shutoffs in 2022 alone. Now I'm going to go over some threats we're seeing from private water companies. The big corporate players are very aggressive right now. They are targeting cash-strapped communities in particular. They often offer large sums of money to entice a struggling city to privatize. But all of that money plus profit will be recovered through hikes in customer water bills. They're also targeting sewer systems, particularly in their water service area. So we're seeing a lot of sewer sales right now in Pennsylvania in particular. They often tend to benefit from emergency management or state or federal oversight that forces systems into privatization. There's also a lot of corporate-friendly state and federal laws and regulations. The private water lobby is busy. A big factor driving water privatization and then higher rates after privatization are corporate-friendly laws and regulations. The big companies have been very successful lobbying for changes that make it easier and more profitable to buy systems and hike rates after privatization. There are quite a number of these laws, often using flowery language that actually obscures what the bill really does. So at the federal level, their big piece of legislation is the Clean Water SRF Parity Act. Parity sounds good, right? So this is from Rep. Garamendi from California and would open up federal wastewater funding to investor-owned utilities. At the state law, they're pursuing many pieces of legislation, notably fair market value legislation, which inflates the value of a system, allowing companies to offer even higher purchase prices to entice cities to sell, then leading to higher profits for the company. But all of this is done on the backs of ratepayers who see even larger and larger water and sewer bills. There's also a piece of legislation that's dubiously named the Water Quality Accountability Act, right? That sounds good. It was passed in New Jersey first, but this actually just imposes a lot of onerous paperwork burden in order to strong arm small municipal systems into privatization. It doesn't actually have any type of measurements for water quality compliance included with it. There's also consolidated rates between drinking water and wastewater services. So they want to charge their drinking water customers the cost of buying up sewer systems that they're targeting. And lastly, and almost the most important thing that they're pursuing is where there are referendum requirements, they want to strip it away. They want to cut the public out of decision making and remove any democracy in this process of privatization. In New Jersey, this was done through a piece of legislation called WIPA, the Water Infrastructure Protection Act, right? But it just in New Jersey, that bill, that with that completely misleading name, curtailed a century-old law that granted the public an automatic right to referendum on privatization of their water system. These companies are using the language of consolidation to justify laws that facilitate privatization and rate hikes after privatization. For example, in its annual report to investors, American Water, the nation's largest investor-owned water utility, said, the company supports full optionality for municipalities, including state legislation that enables consolidation of the largely fragmented water and wastewater industries through third-party fair market valuations of purchased property. So I've included a link to their investor presentation where they show the fragmentation of water systems compared to gas and electricity. So this is one of their talking points, is like highly fragmented consolidation under a big private entity. But as we saw earlier with the second largest investor-owned utility who actually disclosed this information, that a lot of these systems that they buy up, they remain small, they remain isolated, and they're not actually coming together to form one single system because a system is distinct from a utility. So what are the solutions? But despite the millions of dollars that these companies have spent lobbying for pro-privatization legislation and trying to sway public officials, hundreds of communities have won and defeated privatization efforts. They've used a variety of tactics to help guard against privatization, including strengthening local laws to require a public vote, like in Atlantic City, or outright banning water privatization, like in Edison, New Jersey, and Baltimore, Maryland. And before I end today, I want to go back to that root cause. When we think about solutions to water systems, we need to center the historical context. There's decades of austerity and underinvestment, disinvestment, particularly in majority Black communities that underlie most of our nation's biggest water problems, from Jackson to Baltimore. The bipartisan infrastructure law did provide a big boost in federal funding for water and sewer systems, but it was only 7% of the need that had been identified at that time. And a more recent drinking water needs survey found that the needs of our water systems haven't shot up by more than 30%. So our needs are growing every year, and federal funding is not keeping a pace. And right now in Congress, it's a mess. They can't pass a real appropriations bill, and the current proposal from the House Republicans would gut the state revolving fund programs, would gut federal funding for our water. So that is why it's clear that the bipartisan infrastructure law is not enough, and we need dedicated assistance for safe water for all. That's why Food and Water Watch supports the Water Act, the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act in Congress, to create a trust fund to provide dedicated federal funding at a level that is necessary based on the latest needs assessment from EPA for all water systems to comply with federal law. It provides more than $35 billion each and every year to public drinking water systems, wastewater systems, household wells, septics, school water infrastructure. And it is funded through just a tiny little rollback of the Trump administration's corporate income tax cuts. A 3.5 percentage point increase in the corporate income tax rate could fully meet the needs of our nation's water infrastructure. This is just a small rollback of those massive tax cuts under the Trump administration. And I think it really centers the question of what are our priorities as a country. Fundamentally, we need to change how we fund water. We need it to use progressive revenue streams to support system projects and operations. Water bills are one of the most regressive bills you pay. It disproportionately harms low-income families who pay a higher portion of their earnings just for water. We know existing programs to fund water aren't perfect and need fixes too. And I think you'll learn more about what needs to be done to fix these federal funding pools from David at LDF next. But before we wrap up, I want to see if you have any comments, questions, or feedback. So thank you so much.